Joining us now is Richard Dolan. He's a historian, a friend of mine, a researcher, and also best known probably for his work with regard to UAP, unexplained aerial phenomenon, but he also is the host of the Richard Dolan program, and he is going to talk with us a little bit about some of the implications of security threats like this as it relates to law, government, society, and we'll get into some other stuff too. Rich, how you doing?
Micah, I'm really happy to be here with you. It's a real pleasure.
Yeah, it's always a pleasure to talk with you and to get your perspectives on things. And again, I really wanted to hear your take on what's going on down there in Atlanta. I'm amazed, first and foremost, that there is not more coverage of this incident, and let alone the fact that there are other cities that have also been affected in different locations. I mean, what are your general perspectives on what this means and what we can expect in the future?
This is something that I think we have been expecting for a long time. So I assume you explained this to your listeners already. It's an incredible ransomware attack on the city of Atlanta that started a little over a week ago from this recording, March 22nd. And as far as I know, they haven't paid it yet. So you've got hackers demanding $51,000 in Bitcoin from the city of Atlanta. So what's interesting about this is, from my perspective, I've been very interested in seeing technological developments about how either terrorists or other outsiders in the system might use new technologies to disrupt, I think is the right word here, the infrastructures of society. I mean, we all see how connected we are to all kinds of, how everything is connected. So electricity, water, all types of public services, increasingly, everything's connected. And now we're moving into the Internet of Things. So there's always going to be those who are going to be trying to disrupt it. And using Bitcoin, by the way, I think is a very smart move, because it's really secure. And as long as it's being utilized, as long as there's a demand for it, I think it's a smart move for these guys to stay outside the system. In terms of the cyber ransom, I hadn't really wrapped my brain around this one before it happened, so I wasn't quite expecting it, but really I should have expected it. I had been looking at the possibility of individuals using explosives connected to drones, for example, to just shut down airports. You could bring I was reading some thoughts by another guy who's really out on the forefront of this, who was just talking about how you could now create drone swarms hooked up with small amounts of C4 and just guide them to a local airport.
Oh, God, that's wonderful.
A couple of the planes there. I mean, you could shut down the entire transportation hub just so easily now. Why it hasn't happened is actually a shocking development. Like, why hasn't? I think we should expect things like this. So increasingly, we're vulnerable. And in the case of Atlanta, these people, I think, were actually really smart about it, because they're only asking for $51,000, something that a city can just shell out, I imagine, pretty easily. You know, they're banking on the fact that Atlanta's going to have a hard time breaking through their hack, and at some point, just going to say, the hell with it. We're going to do this. Let's just pay them and be done with it. But of course, the problem with that, as everyone can see, is that will further encourage future attacks, and you're at the whim of these people.
Exactly. Same reason government usually will not play by that game. If there's a ransom, we don't pay it, because you don't want to encourage people to keep doing it. And this is not an isolated incident. This has happened at a hospital, at least on one occasion, and certain other towns and municipalities have also been affected by similar attacks, which, I mean, we have the question of how can we quickly harden infrastructure to prevent further attacks? And also, what kinds of new methods, kind of like you're talking about with drones and things. That's scary shit, my man. But it's an inevitability that there will be not, let's see, how do I want to phrase this? We would call them innovative, if not novel, ways of implementing nascent technologies. Again, this is going to be something that we're going to be seeing a lot, and it's going to happen again, and it's very concerning.
Well, there's only two ways that I see that you really deal with a problem like this. So one is you super harden your defenses. And I mean, it's like an arms race. It's always been. You go back to the 1990s. No one had any kind of antivirus anything, and viruses were really simple. And viruses become enough to shut you down. Then you come up with your virus defense and so forth, and it gets more and more intense. And so that's one solution. And this is up to the tech people. You super harden your defenses, and that's your situation. The other solution, which is also being pursued globally by governments around the world, is you spy on everyone 24/7 at all times, and you know exactly who's doing what forever and for the rest of all time. That's a much less appealing solution. But when you really look at some of the threats that are out there, and look, I'm someone who has, for my entire life, I've been advocating on behalf of privacy and on behalf of people vis-a-vis the government. On the other hand, when you look at some of the legitimate dangers that are there, and some of them are legitimate, I've asked myself, how will societies deal with the increasingly widespread technologies and weapons that ordinary people are able to get their hands on?
Yeah.
And it's not an easy question to resolve. So those are the two solutions I see. And really what we're seeing are governments, I think, implementing both sides of that. They're hardening their defenses as much as possible, but at the same time, they're going on the offense, that is spying on every single person.
And see, that's the other issue, again, is that you're going to have to require a loss of privacy to some extent in order to ensure ultimate safety. You know, Richard, one of the issues I've had, and I've talked about this a lot on this podcast in the past with my co-host, we have the issue of, for instance, the Transportation Security Administration, TSA. You travel a lot. You and I have traveled together to some of the same events. You know exactly what I'm talking about when I say it's a huge hassle having to go through an airport. And I was very big on being a critic and a vocal critic of the TSA, and I think I still really am. But the first time in my little hometown of Asheville, North Carolina, I show up at the Asheville Regional Airport, and Richard, there had been a bomb threat that morning that the TSA effectively thwarted. One of my huge criticisms prior to that had been that, well, do we have any good data that suggests that they have been an effective agency in terms of mitigating threats that have been posed at airports and outside of airports and in relation to plans to carry out attacks on airports? I said, have the TSA been effective? Well, they certainly were in Asheville on one instance. And so I kind of had to eat crow in that sense that I'm not happy with some of the things that have happened, the random screenings, being radiated and going through these X-ray machines every time I have to fly someplace. But on the other hand, there's a legitimate service that they provide in terms of protecting against threats. And sometimes the institution of an agency like that in itself can be a deterrent. We all get that, but how much do we want to give up in order to maintain our safety? And that seems to be the ever-present problem since the beginning of the new millennium in this information age. We have to give up some privacy, but nobody seems comfortable with it.
No, you make a valid point. I would quibble with, at least in some cases, when these agencies, whether it's TSA or FBI, says we've thwarted such and such an attempt. Some of these, like in the case of the FBI, it's absolutely been demonstrated that roughly 50% of all of their federally prosecuted terrorism cases have been setup jobs by the FBI. So in other words, they'll find someone of basically sub-level intelligence who may have some radical ideas but really no ability to implement anything. And they will provide them with fake C4, and they'll provide them with fake explosive, fake weapons or like knives and things. And I'll encourage them, and I'm not joking, this happened in my town of Rochester, New York, a couple of years ago on New Year's Eve. They set some guy up. He went in to do his terrorism act, worked up by his connection to the FBI. And then they nabbed him in. People like that will spend the rest of their lives in dark little cells and never get out. And the FBI can then say, we've thwarted a terrorist attack. So there's some of that going on. And I'm not saying that this happened in Asheville. I don't know the details, but it does make me, very cognizant of the fact that the dangers, the genuine dangers that we face from outsiders and even terrorists, those can be real. And it's also absolutely true from my perspective that some of those genuine threats are then used by governments to justify all kinds of measures, which they're all craving for. I mean, these governments, they all want more control. And they can all rationalize it. They can all give you reasons why they need more control to protect society, because they you look at some of these people now in every single presidential administration. They see enemies everywhere they look, and they're not happy until they have total control over every little aspect of the globe. And that kind of attitude can go really overboard. And when you get people like that making policy, I get a little nervous. So there is this, it's a fine line. And I don't know if anyone has an answer for all time. I mean, the fact is, cyber ransomware attacks, like I wouldn't want to be in the city of Atlanta right now if I had to use public services of any sort, because they've got no internet. And these random guys have come in and they have shut Atlanta down, at least partially, for some period of time until they get what they want. So this is a quick way for society to descend into real anarchism and people, just a couple of steps away from really being at each other's throats and killing each other, like quite literally. Because when you shut down the infrastructure of a society, you just watch how fast people lose it. And they will lose it. We're really a half a step removed from total barbarism at any given moment. We forget because we got nice homes and shirts and, internet and all of these things that make us happy. But you take those away and you watch real quickly how people will descend into bloody, murderous barbarism.
I think you're spot on, my man. I mean, have you ever read Bill Forstchen's book 1 Second After? Are you familiar with that?
No, actually I'm not.
So William R. Forstchen, he actually lives right up the road from me here in Black Mountain, North Carolina. And so when we did the George Norrie live event here last fall, and we're doing another one, it turns out, I learned just yesterday, another one later this year, and Bill's going to be back at that one. But in the book 1 Second After, he's a historian, and he was a teacher here at Montreat College, but this thing's a New York Times bestseller, and Newt Gingrich actually wrote the foreword for it. Because they had been looking into the actual realistic threat potential of an EMP, electromagnetic pulse weapon.
Oh, okay. Right.
So the book, however, is a novel which, again, puts together this doomsday scenario where we don't identify in the book who the enemy of the United States was, but 2 nuclear weapons are launched into low Earth orbit, detonated from space.
Oh, but everyone knows it's Russia, Micah.
Well, it could be. In this book,
okay,
I don't recall who it was, although I might like to get your opinion about that. The stories about the super weapon that Russia was talking about a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah, sure.
But with the EMP, again, let's say any enemy of the United States does this, and it's like what you talk about, pure pandemonium results because of the loss of electrical infrastructure systems. I mean, people don't have heat. People don't have water pumps. People can't get gasoline. Most cars that are made after 1995 or so don't work because of the computer chips and the actual programming required to be able to function in those vehicles. So, I mean, all hell breaks loose, and in a very real kind of way. And and again, the spread of information. There's no telecommunication system, so people can't get news. They don't know what has happened. They don't know who did it. It's just we're back to the dark ages. And again, in this era, it might not have been like that a few decades ago. But in this modern era where we have this great dependence on the World Wide Web and on communication systems, having a smartphone in our pocket and being a text message away from our loved ones, we really take for granted the ease and the mechanization of society these days. You take all that away, and like you said, I think really it could get bad really quick.
Well, we've been interconnected for actually centuries, but I mean, to the degree it's much greater now. I mean, even 100 years ago, the world was very interconnected. We just depended on different things like oil, and we depended on electricity. I mean, electricity dependency 100 years ago was pretty intense, and you shut electricity down, people would have a rough time. It's worse now. So we have much more vulnerability, but we've been vulnerable as a society for infrastructure shutdown for a really long time. It's just a matter of degree. But yeah, I mean, I take your point, and that's a very interesting guy. Like, the whole idea of an EMP. This just made the news a couple of months ago, I mean, as everyone was talking about, and people love to really get into panic mode over the predictions of a upcoming EMP blast. And I think there were some people talking about this sometime in 2017. Didn't happen, obviously. But there is a danger. I mean, an EMP event, electromagnetic pulse, is able to disable a large swath of our society, and we're vulnerable to it, I think.
Oh, we absolutely are. I mean, that's maybe one of the preeminent threats. Interesting side note on that. Whitley Strieber, did you know that he wrote a book back in maybe the late 80s, early 90s called War Day? Are you familiar with this book?
Yeah, well, I don't think I've read that book. I may have a copy of it, but I know about it.
Yeah, and that's essentially the premise of that book, although it is an actual land-based nuclear weapon attack in that book. The EMP shockwave takes down communication systems very similarly, and
that's right.
And Christopher McCullum, my co-host here, he actually has always made that comparison between Whitley and his co-author's book and the later penning of 1 Second After.
That makes sense.
It's interesting, yeah. So there's a bit of a precedent for this concern, and it goes back all the way to Operation Starfish Prime, when in 1961 or 2, I believe, we launched a Titan rocket into space, and when we detonated that thing after we launched it from Johnston Atoll, it actually did knock out the electrical grid in as far away as Honolulu, Hawaii. But being a transistor-based system back then, they could get it back online very quickly. Nowadays, again, with the solid-state circuitry, it's actually a much less, it's much more vulnerable technological infrastructure that we have these days, and we're actually more susceptible with the greater reach of technology, and that's the big problem. I want to come back around to this Russian super weapon, okay? You brought up Russia. He said it, not me, okay? Right. So, but I do want to get your take on that because, I mean, so again, what we have in the news is we have reports of Vladimir Putin talking about a weapon that could be unstoppable. In fact, actually making the tie back to UFOs, some people have looked at these pieces of footage that were released by the Pentagon and all that, and they've said, could Russia actually have a lot more technology than we know about? Now, I think that's doubtful personally. I don't think that whatever we see in that footage is anything Russia or any other world power made, in my opinion. But I would like to get your opinion on the possibility that they do have some technology that could concern us.
Yes, well, of course. I mean, first of all, about Putin, it has to be said, and no one says this. All right, Putin has been upset since 2002 when the United States pulled out of the ABM treaty. This is really important, and no one seems to understand. So the anti-ballistic missile treaty was a critical part of Cold War mutual assured destruction, and this idea that, you know, we are going to work with each side is going to work on their nuclear. It basically it was a nuclear treaty, or it was a weapons treaty, I should say, that kept both sides like very happy within the Cold War. And the United States unilaterally pulled out of it under the George W. Bush presidency. And it was the cornerstone of détente, of a kind of a military détente that existed between the U.S. and Russia, even after the end of the Cold War. I mean, Russia was really left in a position, and back in 2002, Russia was much, much weaker than it is today. I mean, Russia had gone through the entire 1990s under the national drunk known as Boris Yeltsin, had handed their entire country over to the West. I mean, the U.S. was very happy with Yeltsin. In fact, they rigged the 1996 Russian elections very happily and proudly and openly. You look at the cover of Time magazine from July of 1996, where they stated how the U.S. won the election for Yeltsin. It's so ironic that we hear all of this utterly hypocritical talk today about Russia supposedly hacking our elections in 2016. There's no evidence ever presented. The point that I'm making is that Russia was so weak in 2002 that the U.S. decided that it could do what it did in 2002 and negate this treaty. And so now you've got 15 years and Russia's like, okay, well, we're on our own. We have to develop our own systems because the United States is going to be shooting our things out of the sky, and we've got to find a way to deal with it. And Russia's infrastructure, militarily, scientifically, is very advanced. It's probably equal to our own. The U.S. spends a lot more money, much more money. I mean, the Russian military budget's about $60 billion, I think $65 billion, which is less than 1/10 the United States military budget. So you just think about that. Let that sit in. When you have everyone talking about this Russian threat, we spend literally 10 times the amount every year or more than what Russia spends. But they spend it, I think, much more efficiently. It seems my impression is that they do. Putin's a guy, if you really study Putin, and I have really studied Vladimir Putin in some detail. I've listened to his speeches, which most people don't do. You would never hear an American president speak as candidly, as matter-of-factly, and as intelligently about national affairs as Putin does about Russia. They're all translated. Go to YouTube and listen to these in translation. So he's not someone who strikes me as someone who does a lot of BS. He's not. I mean, despite what you read in the Western media, it's actually quite the opposite. So if he says that they've got capabilities that exceed anything that the U.S. can defend against, I would at least take that seriously. Now, what all the U.S. national security analysts have been saying is that, no, this is nothing new. It's a lot of hot air. We've already known about this. But then I always hear one little caveat. I've heard this probably 5 times at least now from American analysts. They'll say, well, with one exception. And they don't say what the exception is, but I think this is what you're referring to. I mean, they'll say, well, there's a little bit of a nuance here with one of these weapon systems. And so I think that, what really he is saying is, America, you really stop messing with us. I mean, America is doing nothing but messing with Russia. I mean, that's all that they're doing. They try to take down Russia's ally in Syria down by funding and training and equipping jihadist head choppers and calling them Syrian opposition. I mean, are you kidding me? They're jihadist. They're Syrian Al-Qaeda, literally. The U.S. funded the Al-Qaeda branch in Syria. and call them, they're known as Jabhat al-Nusra, and they call them moderate rebels. This is not a joke. And they drop ship weapons to them and all of this other stuff. And then they got found out, and then they give the weapons to the other groups who were equally radical head choppers, like now the guys in Eastern Ghouta,
right,
and all of it. These are all jihadists, all of them, every single last one of them. There are the only secular fighters in Syria are the Syrian government's Syrian Arab army. That's it, and their Russian allies. That's it. They're the only secular force, and the U.S. is trying to take them down, and that's Russia's ally, and the Russians, understandably, are not going to have any more of it. And the U.S. engineered the coup in Ukraine in the beginning of 2014, and that was obviously a coup where they threw out the elected government and put in their own regime, which is there to this day, and bringing them into the EU, bringing them closer into NATO, and bringing Monsanto in there, by the way, and cutting off all economic ties with Russia, which is what Ukraine and Russia have been, basically one unit for over 1,000 years. Since the 8th century, they've been the same culture. So what the U.S. did, and this is all CIA engineered, and this is an open and shut case. So the Russians know full well what the U.S. is doing, and they know full well that the U.S. will not abide by its word internationally either. Look at what's happening in Iran under now Trump. He's trying to renege on the U.S.-Iranian deal. And whatever one thinks about Iran, the U.S. made a deal, and they're clearly trying to get out of it. So Putin is watching NATO come step by step closer to his border. He's watching the U.S. destabilize his key allies like Syria, and they certainly want to, they would love to destabilize China, but they can't. They don't have the power. They would love to destabilize his country, but they don't have the capability. And he's thinking, we've got to defend ourselves, and this is what they're doing. And he's basically, my take on it, he's showing the United States, this is what you get when you pull out of treaties and when you destabilize our key allies.
Yeah.
So that's how I look at it.
Now, there's so many directions we could go here, but I've got to just say, a lot of people would hear you talking about, like, the CIA carrying out a coup in the Ukraine and say, oh, conspiracy theory. But let's keep in mind, again, we got to look back, what was it, 1954 with the Iranian coup, Mossadegh and all of this? I mean, there is published, the CIA and their history division having published a lot of this data themselves, it was actually released and acknowledged just a few years ago, but it was well known outside. This was, what was it? Gosh, does that go back to was it the Eisenhower administration?
Yeah. Eisenhower. It was 1953 in Iran. And in 54, they did the same in Guatemala, which was almost even worse, frankly. And very few people know about it. Mm-hmm. And then they did it dozens of times in other countries like Laos and Brazil and Indonesia. This is an old game, and no one is better than the United States at doing it, by the way.
Absolutely. The other side of this, though, too, is in this current political climate, and Rich, this being your first time on Middle Theory, the name really says it all. We try to present a balanced, centrist perspective on things. To me, as you are sitting there talking about the relationship between the United States and Russia, and in my opinion, how certain groups in the media and perhaps even certain political parties are exacerbating that, you sound like an analyst to me who is saying, I'm looking at history, which, of course, you're a historian, that's what you do. I'm looking at policy. I'm looking at the response from Putin. I'm looking at the actions by the United States, and I therefore explain his behavior thusly. It doesn't sound to me like you're saying, I love Vladimir Putin, he's wonderful. But in this current political climate, when you break something down like that, you would be called a Russian propagandist. You would be called a supporter of Russia. You would be called anti-American. You would be called alt-right. What is it about?
That's right.
What is it about this current political climate? I don't know if you've been called alt-right. I haven't been called alt-right. I've had people say, Micah, don't stick your neck out for the alt-right.
No, I'm waiting, though. I am waiting to be called alt-right because it's going to happen. It's going to happen at some point. What's funny is that I was a lifelong lefty. You know, I was a subscriber to The Nation for years, and I still am. One of my biggest websites that I love to go to is globalresearch.ca, and they are definitely on the left, but they're considered. Someone considered them alt-right just recently, and I just laughed out loud. That's run by a genius political analyst out of Montreal named Michel Chossudovsky, who's not right-wing in the least. He's very much on the left. But I'm waiting to be called alt-right. It's going to happen. But what's happened, this is the reason, though. The reason, Russophobia. I just read an article on this, which in fact is on my new website, which you helped me set up on Richard Dolan Members. And I just written an article on this, and it's actually free to the public. You can Anyone can read it.
And we'll have that linked in our show notes too, so that folks can find that.
There's something I call Russia derangement syndrome. Like, people have heard of Trump derangement syndrome. And there is definitely, in my opinion, Russia derangement syndrome, which has existed for about 500 years. I mean, Europeans have been terrified of Russia for at least that long. Americans, only a little more in the last 100 years has it really happened to us. And so it's had its ups and downs. But in the last decade, it's really gotten to be intense. And then and actually it was after the U.S. destroyed Libya in 2011. And that's actually the key turning point in the modern era. The United States unconscionably destroyed the wealthiest nation in Africa, named Libya, in 2011. And based on lies, fake YouTube accounts, fake Twitter accounts, fake allegations that Gaddafi was carpet bombing his people. None of that was true. None of it. And Obama got NATO to destroy Libya and steal their gold and prevent them from rolling out a gold-based currency and all of that. So the whole Libya operation was a reprehensible crime against humanity. Putin has never forgiven the United States for doing that. Every account that I've ever read, he basically said, this is not going to happen again. So, and when it did happen, he was actually not president of Russia. He was prime minister.
Right.
You can only be president of Russia 2 consecutive terms in a row. And so his guy, Dmitry Medvedev, was president and Putin was prime minister. So, yeah, I mean, it's Putin, the strong man, doing what he can to stay relevant, but he didn't have foreign policy control. And Medvedev, who was much more of a Westerner in orientation, allowed the United Nations to pass a special resolution that destroyed Libya. I'm going somewhere with this, so just bear with me.
Sure.
Putin becomes president again in 2012, and from that point, he really, I think, made it's very obvious in his foreign policy. He made it very clear he was not going to let the U.S. Smack him around. And in 2013 was the very first time, like, he really stood up, and that was over Syria. And I won't go into the details, but he prevented the U.S. from bombing Syria. He got a diplomatic solution to that crisis at the time and really, really angered the Obama administration, but they couldn't do anything about it. And then, he stepped in 2015 and gave military aid to the Syrian government. This was the first time that Russia had really stepped up in probably 40, 50 years to stand up to the United States in a military way and save the Syrian government from going under. ISIS would have run its flag over Damascus probably any week or month if he hadn't done that. So all that was over Libya. But the real Russia derangement syndrome today stems from the 2016 election, and in which, of course, Hillary Clinton was supposed to win.
Yeah.
And anyone who really looks at establishment U.S. Politics knows that Hillary Clinton was supposed to win that election, and she didn't. And not simply against Trump, but against Bernie Sanders, if you recall. And Bernie, within the Democratic Party, was clearly a more popular candidate.
Come on, yeah.
Bernie was the guy getting crowds. Bernie was the guy getting everyone excited. Hillary's rallies, I mean, the news media never reported this, but no one was attending her rallies because no one cared. No one cared. This is a truly Orwellian situation where you've got the establishment candidate. No one wanted her in, but they were portraying her as if she was someone important, and they made her important. So they minimized Bernie. The Democratic Party, even though they were supposed to be impartial because they were both candidates for that party, and the mainstream media, both promoted Hillary over Bernie. And when WikiLeaks in the summer of 2016 released all those Democratic National Committee emails proving that the DNC unethically and perhaps illegally favored one candidate over another, that is their corporate establishment candidate, Hillary Clinton, over the popular candidate, Bernie Sanders, Hillary's people brilliantly stood up and said, Russia did it, without any evidence ever being presented. This is all summer of 2016. And they were able to make it stick because they had the Washington Post, they had the New York Times, they had CNN, all kissing their ass. And Bernie, Bernie was basically just rolled over and showed what he was made out of, which was nothing.
Which surprised me, actually.
But yeah, well, Bernie just showed he's a shill just like any of these other people. That's all he is. And I tried to feel the burn, by the way. I wanted my nice Jewish grandpa Bernie Sanders in the White House. I thought it would be a nice thing, but it wasn't going to happen because he turned out he's just as much of an establishment shill as any of the others. Or maybe they blackmailed him, or maybe they bribed him. I don't know. But whatever it was, Bernie rolled over.
That whole thing was just weird as hell. I mean, it really was. It was weird as hell. I remember Richard sitting there watching the Democratic National Convention, and him sitting there, smiling, people standing up and clapping around him, basically just handing the entire thing over to him. To hell with the whole movement that had been behind Bernie Sanders. He hands it over to the establishment. I mean, I don't want to go down the conspiracy rabbit hole, but I'll just say this, that it felt more to me like they were like, Bernie, sit down, shut up, or else. Well,
allow me to go down the conspiracy rabbit hole.
Go ahead.
But because this is how politics works. I mean, it's how it worked 100 years ago. It's how it worked 200 years ago. It's how it works today. And that's just the nature of the game. So that's clearly what appears to have happened with Bernie. So now Hillary's going up against Donald Trump, right? America's greatest nightmare or salvation, depending on how you look at him. Trump was demonized. This has to be said. Whatever one says about President Trump, that's a different story. Candidate Trump was a different guy, actually. And candidate Trump was demonized. And it wasn't because he talked like he was a 12-year-old trash talker from Queens, which he is. He's a trash talker from Queens. But that's not why he was hated by the mainstream establishment. I mean, that's why they would say he's a sexist, he's a racist. And they, then bring out whatever evidence they had to support that claim. Sexist, yes. I mean, I will absolutely buy that. Racist, not really buying it. But the real reason they went after Trump is because he, as a candidate, vociferously attacked, critiqued the two main pillars of the American establishment's reason to be. And pillar number one is economic. Pillar number two is political and military. So pillar number one is neoliberal globalization. All right. So that's, exporting jobs to China, exporting jobs to Mexico and everywhere else. And what's interesting about that is that Trump had the exact same position on globalization that I used to listen to 20 years ago from a fellow by the name of Ralph Nader, very much on the left. I mean, if you listen to Nader's statements in the 1990s on globalization, you could literally verbatim lift them and put them in Trump's speeches as a candidate. All right. So the anti-globalization take that Trump had is not right wing or left wing, and it's portrayed as right wing, but it isn't. It's simply anti-globalization, or at least it's saying, let's put the brakes on this a little bit, because you really can't stop globalization anyway, but you can at least try to modulate it a little bit. And that's what Nader was about in the 90s, and that's what Trump was about as a candidate in 2016. But that's absolutely against the religion of the American establishment. Like, whether you're George W. Bush or Barack Obama, it didn't matter. They were both full speed ahead on globalization, as Clinton before them and as George Herbert Walker before them. It doesn't matter what party. So that's the economic plank, and Trump opposed it. And then the political military plank is not neoliberalism, but neoconservatism. And Trump, as a candidate, talked against, like, the war in Iraq in 2003. And he did. He talked against the war in Libya in 2011. And he called these things what they were, disasters. And he was right to do so, incidentally. There was one moment when he was campaigning in South Carolina in 2016, and he goes, this is Republican, hardcore military territory. And he goes into South Carolina and dished out against the wars in Iraq and Libya. And I'm going to tell you, that takes some guts to do that. And he did it, and he was right to do so. So that was candidate Trump. And even Bernie Sanders didn't have the guts to talk against these wars. It's an amazing thing when I look at a guy like Trump, who's so bellicose, and really in so many ways is so ignorant of geopolitics. It's obvious to me.
It really is, yeah.
That he doesn't know a lot. But compare him to the statements of the Queen of War herself, Hillary Clinton, who was one of the main people who destroyed Libya, by the way, her and crazy John McCain and a lot of the other neocons. Hillary Clinton is Dick Cheney. She just wears a pantsuit. They're basically brother and sister. There's no difference in their foreign policy. So Trump, as a candidate, sounded like he was very much opposed to both of these two planks. And that is why he had to be demonized. And there's no other reason. And, the third reason would be he didn't accept the political correct sort of mantra of today, and he went out of his way really to be non-politically correct, and that's a no-no today. Yeah. So those are the three. But really, it's the two pillars of the geopolitical situation where he made himself the enemy. Now, Trump as a president is a different matter. He's completely signed over to the neocons. He has taken on the complete foreign policy of people like Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama and George W. Bush. There's really no difference now.
We're calling Rich. That's what happens, though, when you become president, right?
That's right. Yeah. Now, he's still the other half, the neoliberal, the opposition to globalization. It still seems to me he's still working that to the extent possible. But as far as the international stuff, he's completely gone over to the military. I mean, his entire cabinet is dominated by these people. So, and they've all got it against Iran. They want to take that country down, but yet they're willing to support Saudi Arabia, to the ends of the earth. So there you go.
Well, we could talk about something else here for just a second. The weaponization of words and ideas. Oh, go ahead.
Well, I just want to finish one thing because you asked. I wanted to tie this into the whole Russia thing. So, what's happened is that the Democratic Party and the political establishment, which was so upset over the fact that Hillary lost the election. I mean, they were really mad. They've tied Trump to Russia, by the way, based on zero evidence. I mean, none of this has ever been presented. None. You can't read any. I can't read any. There's nothing tying them to. And in fact, the Congress just said, there's nothing to hang your hat on here either. So they've decided that this Russia thing is just not going to go away. And this is the only time in our lifetime where Democrats have collectively lost their minds over Russia. I mean, that's the job of Republicans. They're supposed to do that, not the Democrats. The Democrats have lost it. I mean, it's absolute. If you listen to crazy people like Keith Olbermann, I mean, I just throw up my hands. I wonder, well, this guy was always kind of crazy, but he's just gone. He's out in, or even Rachel Maddow. Well, she's just as bad.
Almost
entire establishment.
All of them almost as interesting, by the way, as Ed Schultz, who can be 1 minute a Republican, and then he can shift gears, and then he can become a television talking head on one of the most liberal television stations, and then he can leave that and go work for RT.
Yeah, I caught a couple of Ed Schultz. I don't find him all that interesting to me, actually. No. Maybe I could listen more, but I listened to him once or twice, and I thought, meh.
I actually talked to him. I talked to him on the telephone one time back in my talk radio days, and he was kind of a jackass, frankly. But I mean,
was he? Okay.
Yeah, but the problem I have with a lot of this sort of stuff is that there is a general fluidity that you see among people. You put me in a chair behind a desk and in front of a camera, and tell me what slant you want me to give you, and I'll do it. And I'm not exaggerating. I really think that a lot of it is that. And every now and then you might have somebody who shows up on MSNBC or CNN or Fox News, and they actually have a political opinion. And they actually are allowed to espouse that opinion. But, I want to talk about something interesting for a second. There was a WashPost story a few weeks ago, and I'm sure you saw this, where Gary Cohn had resigned as Trump's top economic advisor. When this occurred, Trump and another of his staff were talking about Gary Cohn, and they said he's a good guy. I mean, he's a globalist, but he's a really good guy. The Washington Post took extreme issue with Trump using that term globalist, and they had said essentially this: okay, Gary Cohn, as you can tell with that name, he is a man of Jewish heritage, and Trump and his advisors say, he was good, he was a globalist, but we liked him. Now, it seemed evident based on the context that Trump was referring to his policy, his foreign policy, but the way that the Washington Post treated this just amazed me, Richard. They say, in the alt-right circles, globalist is a term that is often used by conspiracy theorists who are also anti-Semitic. The fact that Trump called Gary Cohn may not have been intended as a racial slur, and in fact, he probably doesn't even know that connotation exists. But they nonetheless tried to drive the point home that what Trump said was racist.
Right. Now, this is really important.
Yes,
I'm very glad you're mentioning this.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is, to me, the way that we see. And what actually, again, I'm a big fan of Nicholas Capaldi and Miles Schmidt in their book, The Art of Deception, which talks about learn to break down language and identify a deceptive argument. And this, to me, is what we would call an unsound argument, where they're saying, well, if this is that and this is that, then if somebody says this, it is also that. And they were trying to explicitly make the connection of racism, which is, of course, the weaponization of an idea, because Trump referred to the guys geopolitical foreign policy, which was amazing to me. Now, is it true that some conspiracy theorists might use that who also have anti-Semitic attitudes? Yeah, you hear people talking about globalists all the time in that capacity, but that does not mean that Trump was being racist when he said it. That was used as an attack against him with words. Now, you tell me why you think that's important, Rich.
Yeah, it's very important. I'm so glad you brought this up. What we're seeing is the word globalist, all right, is becoming, they're inching closer and closer toward calling that a racist term. And once it becomes racist, it becomes hate speech.
Yep.
All right. So, and once something is hate speech, now hate speech in the United States has not been made illegal yet, but hate speech has been made illegal in many other countries. So like it's been made illegal in Britain. It's been made illegal in Canada. It's been made illegal in actually countries now in Malaysia, where they are putting through hate speech laws that will land you in prison. You think Malaysia? Well, yes, it's happening in one of the Central American countries, Honduras, Guatemala. I can't. One of them. I was just reading about this the other day, and also not just hate speech, but fake news, which is all interrelated. And so dispensing, putting out fake news is now increasingly going to likely get people locked up in countries around the world. So, but back to hate speech and globalization. So the Washington Post, which is one of the most evil, reprehensible, and I mean evil with a capital E, newspapers and media outlets in the world. I mean, they essentially are run by the CIA. They're owned by, I mean, I'm not exaggerating.
No, Jeff Bezos, right?
Bezos bought it with CIA money. I mean, he sold his Amazon's cloud service capability to all the three-letter agencies, including CIA. They paid him $600 million for that. He used half of that to buy the Washington Post. I think that's what it was. So, yes, like in the immediate aftermath of making the deal, and if all you have to do is read the WAPO on a regular basis, it's clearly the newspaper of the deep state.
Now, I don't detect any bias there. I disagree with you. I'm kidding, actually.
Oh, okay.
It's horribly biased. It's terrible.
And actually, on our subject of strong interest, the UFO subject, the Washington Post is probably the worst in the U.S. They're not as bad as any of the British newspapers.
Is it worse than Scientific American has been?
Oh, well, okay. I mean, I guess of the mainstream U.S. newspapers.
Gotcha.
Anyway, my point about the thing you brought up here. So it's definitely true that for over 100 years, some of the leading, let's say, progressive intellectuals and forces of the Western world have been Jewish. That's not a racist thing to say. That's a statement of fact. So, from Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels or Marx right on through all of the progressive ideas of today, I mean, Jewish intellectuals have been right there, and they'll be the first to tell you. And it really stems, you could say, from the post-Napoleonic era, where Napoleon's armies essentially liberated Jewish people from the ghettos of Europe, where they'd lived for centuries, and essentially prevented from interacting with the rest of European society. And once they were able to, it was in their interest to promote a kind of integration with the rest of Europe. And they promoted urbanization, and a lot of them became leading bankers and financiers. That's absolutely true, and everyone knows this. So that would tell us that there are among the world's global elite, some of them are Jewish. Now, some analysts will say all of them are, and I couldn't say that, and I don't think that's true. But there are really hard, let's say right wing, analysts out there who are really fixated on the so-called Jewish conspiracy. I have never gone down that road. That's not how I see it. But there are people who they fixate on it, and so that becomes a meme. That becomes this dominant narrative that is picked up by the defenders of globalization. And they see a weakness when they identify it, and they say, those people, that fringe element of the anti-globalist intellectual crowd are anti-Semitic, or at least they criticize Jewish people, so that makes them anti-Semitic. and therefore we can smear the whole globalist, anti-globalist movement as anti-Semitic. And they're doing it more and more. And I don't know how successful they're going to be, but the Washington Post would never miss an opportunity to do what they just did. Like, absolutely.
It's just
and
disgusting.
So they bring in basically identity politics to every subject under the sun, and they just brought identity politics into the idea of globalization. You know, they said, well, you're attacking Jewish people by attacking globalization. And it's, talk about a low blow, underhanded, nasty, devious. I don't have enough adjectives to describe it.
Well, but this is why I emphasize a lot on this program, Machiavelli and the idea of the ends justify the means, because people will fight dirty and do whatever they have to in order to reach an end goal. Now, look, nobody advocates, well, some people I guess do, but I certainly don't. I know you don't. We don't advocate hate speech, and we don't want it. We don't have any room for it in our society. But unfortunately, under free speech protection, people presently are still allowed to get out there and engage they can talk about whatever they want to. They can say whatever they want to say. But there are some instances where there may be actual exceptions. But when we talk about, and I do want to get around to the idea of what you're talking about, legislating anti-hate speech laws in some countries, because while you do want to thwart hate speech, the problem is if a term that has a different meaning entirely becomes associated with a racist idea, and thereby it becomes hate speech, and then that idea that once meant one thing now means something else, and you can go to jail for talking about that. Our friend, yours and mine, Jordan Peterson, encountered very similar circumstances up there in Canada. And by the way, folks, I've got to say right here, I've mentioned Peterson several times on the show recently, but I had not been aware of him. He hadn't been on my radar until this guy, Richard Dolan, told me, Micah, I want you to check out Jordan Peterson. I did. I'm fascinated with him. And I'm even more fascinated that a guy who can call himself a traditional British liberal thinker, that he could be called alt-right or far-right, as he has been continually since he rose to prominence. Let's talk about Jordan Peterson, what he represents, and again, what he stood up against in Canada that got him in trouble.
That's right. Well, I have such tremendous respect for Jordan Peterson, and I think he's been a very powerful influence over the last year and a half now on so many people. He has just blown up. He's become so important in the free speech movement, and thank goodness that he's got the articulate, the brilliant ability that he has to, and the courage that he's got to say the things he does. So I'm a huge fan of him. We're lucky to have him. But the idea is, hate speech in general is hate speech laws, in my opinion, I've felt for years, are really a bad idea. Anytime that you define what constitutes hate speech, you're going down a very, very slippery road when you're trying to regulate the speech of other individuals and restrict them. The United States itself is founded on the principle of freedom of speech. It is our first amendment to our Constitution that the freedom of speech shall not be infringed upon. It is unless this is why we grew up with, at least I grew up with the nursery rhyme, sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me. It speaks to a deep truth here. All right. Actions are not the same as speech. They are not. And I don't care. Anyone says, well, words can incite other people. Words are still words. And, as Peterson has said, and as many people have said for years and years, free speech is not simply another virtue that makes our society a better place. It is an absolute necessity for the mechanism of society to function properly. Without free speech, everything falls apart. All right? Because without free speech, I can't critique you. You can't critique me. We can't make this world a better place. The only reason things get better is because other people, the only reason I can ever get better is when other people tell me what I do wrong. All right? They have to tell me in ways that might be offensive to me, by the way. But then if I'm smart about it, I listen to what other people say, they critique me, and I can correct myself. And then I can do that for them. And we all do it within the realm of speech, not fists and not weapons.
That's right.
And so it's a correcting mechanism for society. And Peterson said this, and he really said it much better than I just did now. But the point is that this is what free speech does. It's our correcting, it's a vehicle that allows us not to go around with our hands around each other's throat. And so when you start infringing on your right or my right to speak freely, then we're really going down then things become unacceptable to talk about. And then the next thing you know, things fester. And then the next thing you know, weapons come out. So no, you need free speech. And so hate speech laws are one of the most pernicious developments of our lifetime. And now they've gone so far beyond that, where, is anyone surprised that Facebook and now Twitter and Google and YouTube are now openly, I mean, they're not even hiding the fact, they're openly censoring their platforms.
Yep.
All right. And I mean, these are things that 10 years ago people would have been, what are you talking about? How do you think you can do this? But they can do it openly now because we've had a generation of indoctrinating the world about the necessity of limiting free speech. And people are buying it. And the young generation of today, the Western world, thankfully there's a backlash, but there's so many young people. I feel like they're just walking zombies. What happened to these people? Young people used to have ideas, and so many of them it's like they've just given up.
They used to be passionate, and they used to be passionate. They used to have ideas apart from the ideas that were handed to them in universities. And yeah, you're right. 10 years ago, if we'd seen the kind of internet censorship that we are seeing today, people would have been apoplectic. But today,
young people want it. They actually
want it.
Like
they're asking for it.
Are the ones who don't. At least it seems to me they don't want the free speech.
No, they want laws passed that regulate speech. They want to actually engage in violence where people are engaging free speech and go out there and try and combat it, i.e. your Antifa movements and things like this. And again, that to me, by the way, is a mischaracterization of liberalism. There's nothing about that to me is liberal. And for people who identify themselves as liberal or traditional conservatives for that matter, or call yourself a centrist for all I care. I don't give a hell. But I mean, the point is that when you see people calling themselves liberal and saying that we are in the defense of liberal ideologies and values, and yet they are wanting to suppress speech, suppress communication, engage in violence when and where necessary, and essentially adhere to an indoctrinated society, that to me is a control mechanism and a very damn scary one.
Another good guy out there, in addition to Jordan Peterson, is I've loved this guy. His name is David Rubin. He's got something called the Rubin Report.
Mm-hmm.
So you're familiar with him. So one thing Rubin had on one of his videos a year or more ago, he said the left is no longer liberal. And what he was saying is that he grew up as, like me, he was on the left, always on the left. And then he realized, what happened to the left? Like, was there an upgrade that I wasn't involved in, that I was not informed about? That they've taken a pill. I haven't taken this pill. For him and for me and for other people growing up in a certain ideology, being on the left involved defending freedom of speech and freedom of expression. And suddenly he's realizing those people on the left that identify on the left were not really doing that. And he said increasingly it was the people that were labeled on the right that were more likely to defend freedom of speech. And so it really caused him to go through a kind of a reevaluation. Rubin's one of these people who's always worth listening to. He's very intelligent, very calm. He doesn't get worked up. He's very, very thoughtful. I love listening to him. But yeah, there's been a transformation of our political discourse, and I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I don't want to smear all of the left with Antifa. I mean, that's just one.
They're extreme.
That's a violent element. But here's the thing. All right, people think things are bad now. I'm here to tell you, you think they're bad now. They can always get worse. Things can always get worse if we are not alert and vigilant. And what I mean is societies can and do and have again and again throughout history devolved into chaos and violence. Right? Rome fell. If you ever want to know if things can get worse, just repeat these two words. Rome fell. Rome ruled the world for 800 years. All right? They dominated. And the barbarians sacked that city in the year 410 and took everything of value that wasn't nailed down out, all the gold, all the riches, murdered, rape, pillage, brutality. And then Rome was sacked a few more times and Rome was gone. By 100 years after that, Italy was a wasteland, a wasteland. All right, society can and does collapse. And in our own society, all right, if anyone has not seen the movie Hotel Rwanda, I would recommend it. And I mean, The Rwandan massacres, the genocide in Rwanda in the 1990s is one of the great, horrible, instructive tales of our lifetime. It went on right under our noses, Most people listening to this podcast were alive at that time.
Mm-hmm.
But the movie gives a very, very interesting take on what can happen. In the beginning, you see Rwanda before the coup, before the violence, and it's a normal functioning society where neighbors are nice to each other, and it's quiet at night, and there's no gunfire in the streets and machetes chopping people up. And then suddenly things start falling apart, and you see just how Rwanda soon devolved into a hell on earth. And it can happen. You think it cannot happen in the United States? It can happen in the United States. And after 20 years of demonizing various forms of other in your population, and left and the right do this both, by the way, okay?
Mm-hmm.
When you start dehumanizing those people you disagree with, this is literally what happened to the Jews in the 1930s and 40s, and it happens to all minority groups, not all, but it happens to minority groups throughout history. You dehumanize them, you rob them of their humanity, and then you can kill them. Then you can steal their homes. This is what the Chinese did under Mao. It's what the Russians did, and Peterson talked about this, and I've studied, the Russians did under Stalin against the so-called kulaks, the landowners in the 1920s who were suddenly turned into the great boogeymen of Russia. My God, they're stealing all your land. Take their land.
Yeah.
You demonize a group of people, and that allows you to kill them. And that process of demonization is happening in the Western world. We saw it in the 2016 election. The 2016 election was the first election in my memory where not just the opposing political candidate was demonized, in this case Trump, but his supporters were so demonized that probably half of them, or at least many of them, wouldn't tell their relatives they were going to vote for him.
Yeah, really.
They were afraid of the stigma because they were suddenly considered bad people. All right? I don't know of this happening in my lifetime. I'm just not aware of it happening. Like, you vote for so-and-so, that means you're a bad person. Wow. Really? And again, it's not simply that the left did this to the right, but I think that the left's actions in the last election were more extreme than that of the right. That's my take on it. The right wing, they've constantly denigrated the left. They call them libtards and stupid things like that are absolutely beneath civil discourse. So
all that kind of language
no one
really
is immune to this.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? Both sides have contributed to this. But I just would say in the last few years, what the transformation of the left has been very disturbing to me. When I was a younger person, it was the 1980s, and I watched the Christian right dominate discourse in a way, or at least achieve a prominence in a way that I thought was really very distressing. And then we get, like the church lady on SNL, Dana Carvey, being like the symbol of the Christian rights, like, the nanny saying, don't do this, don't do that. Well, guess what? That's the left now. The left has become the church lady, and they're the finger-wagging, moralistic preachers that everyone hates. Honestly. So now it's their turn to demonize the opposition, and it's not fun. I don't like to see what's happened to the left. They've abdicated the real role, which is freedom and promoting the freedom of all people to pursue their ideal of happiness as long as you're not harming someone else. It's not to keep people safe from bad feelings. It's not to keep people safe from harmful opinions. Are you kidding me? It's about freedom is dangerous. Freedom's not safe. If you want freedom, you better be prepared for risk.
Yeah.
Otherwise, go get a check from the government, live on welfare, and don't stick your neck out.
Well, freedom is dangerous, but if you think freedom is dangerous, look at the alternatives. And that's the thing. We exist in a constant state of flux, we as humans. Human beings, they do terrible things. We think terrible things. We feel disenfranchised. We feel like this person has more or gets more than we do. We want that. That person becomes the enemy. We nitpick. We fight. We engage in flame wars. We troll people's Instagram feeds and their Facebook pages and their Twitter threads. This is human nature. And again, so speaketh the historian. Rome fell. Don't think it couldn't happen again. Physician, heal thyself. Society does usually come around, but, the issue is that we tend to see a cyclical nature over the years, over the centuries with humankind. Don't think that we have engaged in so much collective evolution that it couldn't happen again. There's some definitely concerning things happening in America right now. Hey, Dolan, I want to thank you for jumping on with me today and everything. This has been a real treat. We should do it more often. I love to talk to you and get your perspectives on things, and I value them. And I do want to give you a second just to tell people where they can find out about you and your work.
Oh, thank you so much, Micah. I just want to add this. I don't think I have ever done this type of an interview with anyone before. So this is a unique interview that hopefully your listeners will hopefully they'll enjoy it. But anyway, they've got it. So I've never done this one before. And yeah, my new website, and I really have you and my fiance Tracy Garbett to thank for this. Both of you really were instrumental in helping me create richarddolanmembers.com. So this is my member site, and it's still new. It's still a little baby, but I'm populating it every day right now with new content for members, and for, you can just stroll in. There's a lot of free stuff in there as well. And this is my new home. I still have richarddolanpress.com, where all of my books and books of my authors are there for people to look at. But the member site is something for me, really to work my ideas and my research and share that with the world. And I'm happy with it. It's you've helped me learn the virtues of WordPress.
Ah, well.
So I was really afraid to go down the WordPress road again. I tried it once before and I was afraid of it. But I think it's going to work out, and I'm really grateful, Micah. Your listeners need to know how incredibly helpful you have been to me and to Tracy in getting this going. It's been you've gone above and beyond. You're like the angel sent from heaven, and I will never, ever forget what you've done. I always have my gratitude for that.
I like to help people. I really do. I also like to share ideas and exchange views and opinions, even with people whose opinions I may not always agree with. But I mean, as far as yours go, I think you're spot on. And I think it's equally important that, we get those kind of ideas out there, and we understand that the weaponization of terms and ideas and things like we're seeing these days, I mean, it's really, to put it eloquently, it's all bullshit, at least mostly. And I would like to see more and more of people saying it's not D or R or left or right or night or day. Just look at the idea, spot the deceptive elements, and understand when something is true or not. Use your own truth detector. It exists between your ears. It sits squarely within your skull. It's called a brain. Use it from time to time. Richard Dolan certainly does. And thank you again for joining us here today on Middle Theory, my man.
My pleasure, Micah. Thanks so much for having me on.